there's a mistrust in government that the Treasury just thinks, with some justification, that HS2 has just gone completely off the rails and has ended up spending a vast amount of money without kind of proper project oversight.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast with Christian Walmart, the podcast where in every episode we try to bring you the latest breaking news stories, analysis and interviews from across the world of transport. I'm Mark Walker and I have spent a lifetime working in the transport industry, analysing policy developments and legislation. And with me is the eponymous star of the show, Christian Walmart. So Christian, what's on our agenda for this episode?
Well, hello Mark, and thank you for that introduction, and hello to all our listeners. Well, we've got quite a lot of me today because I've just been to India and discovered a lot about the railways there, and particularly about Mumbai, and I'm going to recount that. I've also got a bit of an exclusive about, pressure from within the industry, both inside HS2 and outside amongst the politicians, to kickstart the section between Handsacre Junction, Birmingham and Crewe, because there's concerns about the fact that the powers to build this might actually wane and be extinguished. And also I'm going to have a little chat about my friend Rod Smith, who sadly died in a hiking accident very soon after our joint trip to Japan. And that will be the item, oddly enough, for the departure lounge.
So Christian, we're in Peterborough for the first time together, recording an episode here in my base and home. But you've just returned from another of your worldwide odysseys, this time to India. Now, in the previous episode, listeners will recall that we recounted, actually live from India, the first stage of your visit and your experiences there on this current trip. But we've got a number of aspects to report back on today. And the first one is what you encountered in the great city of Mumbai.
Yes, this is a fantastic story, actually. And let me just say, this is the second of my 3 long-haul trips, which are all railway related. And 2 of them are for the book I'm writing about high-speed rail. So I've been to Japan, I've been to India, as I'll recount at the moment, and I'm going to China in a couple of weeks' time, and will report from there as I'm getting a series of amazing visits with various officials about high-speed rail. So, India was, as always, fascinating. Big contrast between Kolkata, which I mentioned on the previous podcast, where, to be honest, not much had happened. And in terms of transport, their tram was basically being abandoned. They're building a new metro second line, but it's all very slow. Contrast that with Mumbai, where it's all happening. I was privileged to go round with my friend Raj Alkekla, who works for a local paper as, well, he's now the deputy city editor, but he specialises in transport. And we spent a couple of days going round the various different transport systems in Mumbai and the new projects there are, for example. A new metro line, which is not yet completed, but is certainly underway. And I must say, I was very impressed. So the first bit we saw was a monorail, and they've only got one monorail. It's about 12 kilometres long, and it's quite successful. You have to go up to get to it. It's all on kind of concrete stilts. And it looks like most monorails, kind of rather odd. It kind of sits astride a kind of great big concrete block. But it was quite well used. I was there on a Sunday. It was quite well used. It's kind of like a outer circle line, really. It doesn't really go into the town at all. But I've always thought that's a bit of an underused technology. There's not many monorails in the world. I don't know if you've ever travelled on one.
I'm afraid I think my only experience was Butlins at Skegness, because probably like many people in the UK. We went there I went there as a child, and I think I'd lobbied to go to Butlins at Skegness specifically for that experience. Right. So I dare say there are many people that have a similar recollection. But no, it's not a technology that's ever really caught on.
No, I think Gatwick Airport has a kind of it's a kind of automatic railway. I don't know. It's not really a monorail. Birmingham Airport, I think, had one for a while, and that's been ditched.
And I believe there's one going into Cairo, isn't there?
Right.
Because
yes.
the Alstom factory in Derby is building the vehicles, I think, for the Cairo monorail system.
But somehow it's just not. And then there's kind of maglev as well, which we won't go into at the moment because I often banged on about maglev. But it's just a technology that's never quite kind of ever really expanded. I mean, Sydney had one when I went there about 15 years ago, and then by the time I went there again a few years later, it had disappeared.
Right.
And Bangkok has got one, which does still operate, I think. But it's somehow it just never quite took off. Anyway, but the monorail in Mumbai is flourishing and was quite a nice little ride, a bit bumpy, but quite fast. And then my friend Raj took me up to a different system, a metro in the sky this time, as a normal underground, which was at a high level rather than kind of being underground. And that was the oldest metro line, about 15 years, I think, old in Mumbai. Very crowded, very heavily used. Some concerns. There was people on the platform to stop people kind of rushing to the train at the end, because apparently they'd had incidents where people's clothing had got caught in the doors and they got kind of dragged along and stuff. So they had people kind of stopping you doing that. But this was kind of a bit old-fashioned, and there were only, I think, 3 cars on the system, and they certainly needed kind of more cars than that. And Raj said to me that actually they didn't have the money to expand it at the moment, but they hope to do so at some point. But then he took me to their amazing new metro, which is partly open. It's open out to the airport, and it will eventually go all the way downtown to Colaba, which is at the bottom of the peninsula. Mumbai is on a kind of thin peninsula. Colaba is where the gateway to India is, which was inaugurated by, I think, King George V in 1911. And they're building a metro all the way down there, which will absolutely make a huge difference. Because at the moment it's only goes to the airport from a suburb at the moment. And wow, this is an amazing new metro. I mean, this is not quite the Elizabeth line. I was quoted in the local paper as saying how good it was, and I was actually quoted as precisely this, saying it not quite as good as the Elizabeth line, but almost there. It's on a very big scale. The platforms seem to be about 200 metres long. There's platform doors. There's quite a lot of space at the stations. They're very impressive indeed. And you think, wow, this is kind of Mumbai, which is known for traffic chaos and kind of pollution and rickshaws and the like, or motor rickshaws and the like. And now they're getting, a real 21st century metro line, and this is going to be part of they're building 7 or 8 metro lines. It's not going to be finished till about 2040, but this is part of complete transformation of the city, and very impressive indeed. and then
And
just
clearly, sorry, just to stop you there, Christian, but they clearly valued your opinion on the quality of their new metro. That it was reported that
on the front page of the local newspaper. Yes.
yeah, quite a compliment.
I was and I have sent that out on Blue Sky so people can look at that. And then it took me to the other end of the scale, as it were, which is the old-fashioned suburban rail network, which is very intensively used. I mean, absolutely, so it's the ones where you get pictures of people kind of strap hanging with open doors and kind of holding on for dear life, and people piling onto them in great numbers. And that's still the bedrock of the transport system. There's lines kind of everywhere. It carries 7 or 8 million people a day, and has an appalling accident record. That there's about 2,500 deaths a year on this system. Now, Raj was quick to tell me that some of that is just people dying, right? That people live on these tracks and they just die and they're found dead next to the tracks.
Just of natural causes.
Natural causes, yes, or whatever. And they haven't necessarily been killed by the trains. But there are still, and they itemise these, they have a table of how people died, and there's still about between 1,000 and 1,500 who are killed by the trains, either because people fall off them or because they're hit by trains. And every driver says, because there was an article when I got there was an article about the motormen, the drivers, and they were talking about how many times they'd killed people, and it was 116, 125, 1 dozen. They'd all killed quite a lot of people, and it's quite. It's just as traumatic for them as it is for our drivers, who unfortunately have many fewer. But every time, and they now actually instituted procedures to help the drivers overcome the kind of upset and give them time off and special kind of counselling and all that, because it's a terrible burden. And so the system is absolutely the lifeline of Mumbai, and it's very cheap. So it costs about 10 rupees for 10 kilometres, and so a rupee is about a penny. So you can get as far as 10 rupees,
Wow.
10 for 10 kilometres, and some of it's sometimes 20 or 30 kilometres, but I mean you can get it, whereas the metro is more expensive than that, which starts at about 20 rupees and goes up to about 50, 60, 70. So it's more expensive.
And of course, many of our listeners, like me, will have read your book Railways and the Raj, which described the British period of rule and the establishment of railways during that era. So does this suburban network track its way back to the imperial?
Absolutely. Indeed, the first line was 1853, which was actually one of the lines of the suburban system from Mumbai to Thane, which is about 30 kilometres, and it is now one of the heavily used line. And also, very impressively, they were celebrating 100 years of electrification, and the first line again was that same line, or one of the suburban lines in Mumbai, was the first line to be electrified in 1925. And now which brings us nicely on to the general Indian railways, because there's been a massive program of electrification, and there's somewhere like 90% they've got to now is electrified.
90? Did you say 90?
90, yes.
That's amazing.
From kind of much lower base, and they intend to have the whole system electrified within the next 5 or 10 years. And they've also changed the gauge, because a lot of the smaller lines were meter gauge, and they've now changed it to the Indian gauge of 5'3", and that was done to enable all the trains to go everywhere on the system.
So that's quite a broad gauge, isn't it?
It is quite a broad.
Yeah.
It's a broader gauge, which was instituted by the instigation of Lord Dalhousie, who devised the first railways, the Governor General, and for some reason he didn't want the standard gauge, which is something of a mistake, of course, because in terms of rolling stock, it would have been easier to do that. But somehow you want a broader gauge. I'm on the mistaken idea that it was more stable or whatever. But anyway, so India's national rail system, which is still really a very fundamental part of the nation's infrastructure. Of course, they have built some motorways and they have built some better roads and improved it, but nevertheless, it's absolutely a kind of key part. And the Indian railways in India are symbiotic. You can't really separate out the two. But on the point of motorways, they have built a huge motorway that takes you from the centre of Mumbai towards the airport. And it's a toll road, and it's got a huge 5-kilometre tunnel, and I mean, it's very impressive. Except, of course, as you get near the airport, the last 3 or 4 kilometres are kind of slightly narrower and older road. And it took us a good half an hour to do the last 3 or 4 kilometres to the airport, which is always the problem with roads.
So often the case,
you once you get off the main beautiful new road, you end up with the old system, and I don't know how they're going to solve that, because the entrance to the airport is also going to be quite crowded and stuff and whatever. I mean, we had to allow an extra kind of hour to get onto the plane. And so on Indian Railways generally, they're back almost to pre-COVID numbers. It's quite a heavily subsidised system. And it's pretty cheap to get around. Generally, they haven't put the fares up for about 10 years because it's a very politically charged thing. So it's heavily subsidised, and it's subsidised from freight. And now here's the most impressive thing, Mark, is they're building a whole trunk network that is only for freight and which parallels the passenger network. And they've finished some chunks of it, but it's going to go all the way around India. And the most impressive thing is it's going to take double-deck kind of containers.
Right. And
they're doing that by a special catenary, which is much higher than normal, with a special kind of system to enable the current to be taken kind of with the pantograph, a kind of much bigger pantograph and much more solid looking pantograph. And they're going to finish this in a few years' time, and it's going to be entirely for freight. So it's a parallel system of railways that is purely for container freight.
There's a dream for British
yes.
freight operators.
Well, we did, of course, have an idea for a line once, if you remember, that it was going to be a line down from Liverpool down to the Channel Tunnel.
Grand Central, or
yes, railway something,
yeah.
And it was a great idea.
Yeah.
I was a great supporter of it. I met them several times, and of course, nothing happened because we don't have that imagination.
But coming back to the passenger side, there is a high speed line being developed.
And there's also a high-speed line. Yes, there's a high-speed line that is being built about 500 kilometres between Mumbai and Ahmedabad. And I travelled on the conventional railway alongside it for a long part of that. And you can see a lot of construction, also some missing bridges and stuff. They're hoping to open it in about 2 years' time. But a lot of it has been completed. It will completely transform that particular journey. But I think developing a network is going to be very expensive, and they're doing it very slowly compared with Japan, which already has about 5,000 kilometres, and of course China, where I'm going next to see the railway, is approaching 50,000 kilometres of high-speed line. And all built since the beginning of this century. Quite extraordinary.
We've been discussing high-speed railways in India, Japan and China, but let's bring it back to the homeland and the situation with High-Speed 2 in the UK. You have some news, Christian, on this.
Well, yes. I mean, there's a lot of pressure coming up, both within the rail industry and from local politicians, the mayors in particular, to ensure that something happens on the section that was scrapped so randomly by Rishi Sunak at the 2023 Tory party conference, kind of shockingly, where without any thought about really the consequences or what he was doing, he just scrapped the plan to build HS2A, which is the section between Handsacre Junction, just north of Birmingham, and Crewe. And so there is pressure to do something because the powers to do this will run out 5 years after they were passed, and they were passed in February 2021. So there's just a year, slightly under a year, for all the land to be purchased. And apparently you have to purchase all the land before you can proceed with it, and you get the full powers. And after that you can hold on to it, and you don't have to start work straight away. But if they allow the powers to lapse, I'm told that it would really push the project back 4 or 5 years, and it just might not happen, or it will be kicked into touch. And the important part of this is the busiest part of the West Coast Main Line. This is the part that really could do with some new tracks. So it's the Stafford bypass, essentially.
Sure.
And that section is, gets all the freight coming up from, say, the Channel Tunnel to Liverpool or Manchester or even further north. It gets, lots of passenger trains. It is a very busy track that desperately needs new capacity. So to deliver new capacity, it's also much cheaper. The whole point about the original section is there's lots of tunnels and bridges and whatever. This is a cheap section to build. Say, now there's a debate here. You could build probably the 25 miles between Handsacre Junction and a place called Madeley, 10 miles south of Crewe. You could probably build that for 6 or 7 billion, which, given that we're going to spend about 70 or 80 billion on what I call the Acton to Aston shuttle, is really good value for money. This is the kind of most effective part of the railway. And you could get away with not building the last 10 miles to Crewe if you don't want to add much freight capacity. If you want freight capacity, you probably have to build the remaining section to Crewe, which would run parallel to the line, but does require some tunnelling there, so it would be more expensive. So maybe a total bill of 10 billion. But given that, we will have spent, as I say, 60 or 70 billion on the first section, and all we're going to get is a line between Old Oak Common, or eventually, hopefully, Euston, and Birmingham International and Birmingham Curzon Street, and a section that continues north up to the Handsacre Junction, where it will rejoin the crowded West Coast Main Line. It does seem logical to continue it, but is there the appetite to do that? They do need to get their fingers out to actually do this quite quickly over the next few months. Otherwise, the powers will lapse.
And those powers could be used, presumably, for some of the slightly cheaper alternatives to HS2 as originally conceived, which have been suggested by, for example, the mayors of the West Midlands and Greater Manchester.
Absolutely. It doesn't have to be 360 or 400 kilometres per hour. You could build it, probably, I've been told by an inside source, that probably the most economic and advantageous speed would be about 270 kilometres an hour, right? You could build it to that would balance the cost with the value you'd get from it. So nothing like the 400 kph that the original line is built to. And it's in a way it's a no-brainer if you want to improve the railways, but as somebody famously once said, there is no money. And moreover, there's a mistrust in government that the Treasury just thinks, with some justification, that HS2 has just gone completely off the rails and has ended up spending a vast amount of money without kind of proper project oversight. And, they do have a point in saying that. So they don't trust the department to be able to do this. They'd want some sort of PFI deal or something. But as you know, PFI deals end up being very expensive and unwieldy.
And there were several attempts, particularly under the previous Conservative government, to introduce private finance into railway infrastructure, none of which were really successful, at least so far. And then, of course, there's, as you rightly say, Christian, there's the competition for funds, isn't there? There's an interesting symmetry here that this Handsacre to just south of Crewe section would cost about £10 billion. And the government's considering spending £10 billion on a road scheme linking Essex and Kent, the Lower Thames crossing, in the southeast of England, and not actually very environmentally positive or sustainable, and something that you indeed have written and spoken about. So an interesting balance there between a scheme for the Midlands and the North at 10 billion and a scheme for the southeast at 10 billion. Rail versus road, tough choices having to be made by the Department for Transport and the Treasury.
No, that's a very
coming weeks.
That's a very apt way of putting it, and I hope that some politicians will pick up on that kind of angle and try and emphasise that. You want an environmentally friendly scheme that will help the north compared to an environmentally very damaging one that is only going to help the south. A very good point, Mark.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
And it is indeed something from a departure lounge, because I've just been to the memorial for Professor Rod Smith, who was a great advocate for high-speed rail. He was very knowledgeable about Japan. He was married to a Japanese woman for 50 years. And tragically, he was killed very soon after he came back with me from our joint trip to Japan, where he showed me around a lot of Tokyo, and he introduced me to various Japanese railway officials who all knew him and kind of respected him and so on. And then he was tragically killed in a hiking accident on Boxing Day, on his 77th birthday, in the Lake District, one of those kind of terrible events that take you just by actually shock you, and was a great shock to me, because I'd spent 10 wonderful days with him. He was a very warm man, very knowledgeable, great sense of humour, liked tucking in, particularly he liked tempura. We'd always order tempura wherever he wanted, which I felt wasn't very good for his heart, but anyway, didn't make any difference. He was just very charming and enormously respected within the Japanese rail industry. And along with a couple of other people, he was actually responsible for bringing the bullet train, the driving car, the bullet train, to the National Railway Museum in York. And it's there thanks to the fact that Rod had all the right contacts to get it donated and paid to bring it over, because it wasn't an easy job. So it was a very nice memorial service in Oxford just last week, and very moving. And I did manage to talk to his wife, because I took one of the last pictures of him, and she had seen the picture. It's a very nice picture of him at the kind of place where the first railway line in Japan was built. Farewell, Rod, and I was so sorry to hear about what happened to you.
Calling All Stations, the Transport Podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media channels, including Blue Sky, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle on X is @AllStationsPod.